When we moved from New York to the mountains of Virginia, we knew it was going to be a different way of life. But we had no idea how different things were about to get. My wife Claire and my daughter Emma were both excited, and I was happy to be giving my family a safer and more peaceful life. Claire was pregnant with our second child and was pretty far along, so she could only be but so physically interactive with Emma. Couple that with the fact that I worked long hours in my home office, often on sales calls, well into the dinner hour, only to be able to spend but so much time with my little girl as well. But Emma couldn't be bothered. She had always been a self-aware and intuitive child, the kind of kid that had no trouble occupying her time alone. So naturally, when she realized the former owners of the gorgeous historic farmhouse we had just moved into had left a small playground out back, the swing set became where we could most often find her. We had been settled in about a month, and while exiting my office after a long phone call, I glanced out the kitchen window and noticed Emma swinging wildly while Claire spoke with her. However, when Claire came back inside, I noticed that Emma was still speaking to herself. "Who is she talking to?" I asked. "We're in a new phase, Robert. Our little baby has her first imaginary friend." I smiled. After all, how uncommon is it for a child of her years to have an imaginary friend? "Does this little girl have a name?" I asked, still wrought with confusion and intrigue. Then, I thought about the reality that her little friend might, God forbid, be a little boy. Or is it... "It isn't little, nor is it a girl," said Claire with a laugh. "It's Bullet." Bullet? Mr. Bullet. "I haven't gotten a first name yet," she said, laughing further. That night, I went to tuck Emma in. She put on her favorite pajamas, grabbed Polly, her little stuffed horse, and settled into her bed. I sat on the edge of her mattress and took her by the hand. "So, Mommy tells me you made a new friend out back." She shook her head yes and smiled. "Mr. Bullet!" she exclaimed. "Mr. Bullet, right. And he's how old exactly?" "Old," she said with a shy chuckle. "How old?" "Old like Grandpa." "Well, you tell Mr. Bullet that I look forward to meeting him." I kissed her forehead, said goodnight, and that was it for a little while. Emma would tell us all about how he would sing to her when she would swing, and how he would join her for backyard tea parties whenever myself or Claire could not. We didn't think too much of it until one night while in my office, Claire came to the door. "Robert." I looked up to see my wife nervous. I hit my feet. "Sweetheart, what is it?" "It's Emma. I went to tuck her in just now, and she..." Claire began to sob. "She what? What is it?" "This sounds crazy, but she swears Mr. Bullet told her that the baby is going to be premature." I froze. After all, Emma, while aware that Claire was pregnant, didn't have the vaguest idea about premature birth or any terminology regarding pregnancy. "She used the word premature?" I asked. Claire looked up at me with terror in her eyes. "Yes, 3 times. She says Mr. Bullet wants to warn us." The next day brought the start of the weekend, and the weather was perfect. Emma got done with her breakfast and we went outside to the swing set. I gently pushed her on the swing and was working up the confidence to ask her about Mr. Bullet's warning when I heard Claire shriek in pain from inside the house. I raced through the door and found her lying on the kitchen floor, clutching her stomach. She wasn't due for another 6 weeks, but there was my wife, in labor, about to give birth to our son. She was rushed to hospital, and Emma and I were right behind her. Luckily for us, little Robert Jr. needed a lot of immediate attention, but in the end, he came into the world just fine. After leaving Claire and the baby at the hospital, I took Emma home and sat her down in our living room. "Honey, please tell me what Mr. Bullet said to you." She looked out the window and then back at me. "Daddy, am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, not one bit. I just want to know how it was Mr. Bullet knew that your brother was going to be born soon." She shrugged her shoulders and looked at me with bewilderment in her eyes. "I don't know. He just told me to warn Mommy because he didn't want anything bad to happen to her or the baby." "But honey, Mr. Bullet is your imaginary friend. Mommy and I watch you playing out there, and we see that he's just pretend." "He is not pretend," she shouted defiantly. I was getting both mad and further perplexed. "So you can see him? Like the way you see me and Mommy?" "Yes, Daddy." I actually caught myself glancing out the window, like an idiot. "He's not there right now, Daddy. He doesn't come around at night because he doesn't want to scare anyone. He's my friend." The next morning I saw our neighbor Tom cutting his lawn. Tom and his girlfriend Wendy were the kind of folks you wanted to live next door to. They had become the closest thing to friends we had made since moving to the valley. While he was only in his mid-30s, Tom had grown up in the area. So I asked him about the name Bullet, but to no avail. Tom did, however, suggest that I meet with Mrs. Carson, who lived over on the edge of town, as she was the oldest living woman in the valley and had been the town administrator before retiring. She knew every name from here to the end of the Shenandoah Valley. After calling Mrs. Carson, she agreed to let me come introduce myself and speak with her. So I left Emma with Tom, and I headed over to see her right away. Her old house sat on the very edge of the valley, and while weathered a bit, was well kept for a home of its years. I was greeted by a kindly yet stern woman who was quick to ask me how she could be of assistance. I explained the whole story to her from the first mention of Mr. Bullet through the previous night's chat with Emma. "I don't know of any families around here named Bullet," she said firmly. "Matter of fact, I don't know that I've ever heard of a Bullet family anywhere." I sunk into myself. "Okay, then I guess I'm sorry to trouble you." I turned to leave, but as I did, Mrs. Carson stopped me. "Is your home over on the east side of the ridge, on the other side of town?" "Yes." "Why, yes it is." The woman tightened her lips and squinted her eyes. "The blue-gray house with the child's playground out back?" "Yes." Her eyes opened back to normal. "Bullock!" she exclaimed. "Bullock?" "The land on the other side of your property, owned by John Bullock." My rage grew into a frenzy. The creepy old man next door had been hiding in the bushes and messing with my little girl. It was all I could do to stay remotely calm in front of this poor old lady. "Thank you, Mrs. Carson. I'll head directly over there." "Won't do you no good," she shouted as I began to walk down her stoop and towards my truck. "Why is that?" I asked almost sarcastically. "Because he's dead," the woman fired back. "What? Dead?" She began to point her finger at me. "Mister, I don't know if you're playing games with me, or what's going on with your little girl, but I've about hit my wit's end with this mess already." She began to turn and retreat into the house. "Wait!" I shouted, racing back up the stoop. "I heard you were the town administrator for some years, and I know you've done a lot with the community. Do you by chance have a photograph of this Bullock guy?" She glanced back. "Wait here," she said, rushing into the house. Moments later, she came back outside with a manila folder. In it was an old black and white photograph of some of the town's elders from decades gone, about a dozen of them. Mrs. Carson pointed to a stoic-looking man in a dark suit. "That's him," she said affirmingly. I raced back to grab Emma from Tom and Wendy's and sat her down in my office, turning on my bright but overpriced desk lamp. "Let's play a game, Emma. Close your eyes, sweetheart." Emma closed her eyes tightly, the way only an innocent child can. I carefully laid the photograph down in front of her. "Okay, I have a picture for you to look at when it's time to open your eyes. When I count to 3, I want you to look at it, okay?" She nodded her head with a smile, still squinting her eyes tightly shut. 1, 2, 3. Her eyes weren't open for a split second when a huge smile came across her little face. "Mr. Bullet!" she shouted, pointing right at the man in the dark suit.